Let's take a look at the final parts of the Cold War. Gorbachev's reforms spread across Eastern Europe, but they had unintended consequences, and Eastern European countries simply called for more and more independence. After Brezhnev's call for solidarity and a dedication to communism, Gorbachev shifted to suggest that Eastern Bloc countries could have more of a say over how to run their governments. The Brezhnev Doctrine officially ended in December 1988. Gorbachev focused on allowing glasnost in the Eastern Bloc, thinking that this would lead to higher living standards and no need for further reforms. He believed that by allowing reform, unrest in Poland among trade union solidarity and the Roman Catholic Church would subside. The military costs involved with maintaining the Warsaw Pact were proving too great an economic burden. The USSR needed to improve relations with the West to rebuild its economy. As a result of this, Gorbachev wanted ideology to play less of a role in foreign affairs. He announced that troops would no longer be used to support communism in Eastern Europe. This led to revolutionary movements across the Eastern Bloc. Throughout the summer of 1989, demands for change had been growing in many Eastern German cities. With the protests escalating, eventually the Berlin Wall was brought down, and this was a symbolic marker of communist collapse. Let's look at the timeline of revolutions in Eastern Europe. In August 1989, Hungary opened its border with Eastern Germany. In October 1989, Gorbachev announces freedom for Eastern Bloc countries to choose their own path. In November 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. In December 1989, communist governments fell in Bulgaria, Romania, and Czechoslovakia. Throughout the summer of 1989, demands for change had been growing in many Eastern German cities. Protests focused particularly on grounds outside the Stasi, who were the secret police headquarters in Leipzig. Erich Honecker, who was the leader of East Germany, could not guarantee that he had the support of Gorbachev if he needed to use force to deal with the protests. Honecker resigned and he was replaced by the more moderate Egon Krenz. East Germans could already travel to West Germany through Hungary and Czechoslovakia. In a press conference, an East German government official incorrectly announced the opening of the checkpoints through the Berlin Wall. No directives as how they should be carried out. Protesters were then able to break down the wall without retaliation. Soviet troops were withdrawn from East Germany. Troops were then withdrawn from many Eastern European countries from 1990 onwards. US, French, and British troops were still posted in West Germany. The fall of the Berlin Wall was the most symbolic marker of communist collapse in Eastern Europe. This brought about the thaw in the Cold War, so the ending of the Cold War. So, following the fall of the Berlin Wall, protest movements rose against Eastern Europe. The USSR ultimately fragmented into many different states, and the ideological conflict between the East and the West came to a final end. The Warsaw Pact ended in July 1991. This was a military pact. So military leaders from the USSR no longer controlled the troops included in Warsaw Pact countries. But NATO continued to exist, and it took on former members of the Eastern Bloc such as Hungary and Poland. The Conventional Forces in Europe Agreement in 1990 limited use of non-nuclear weapons and troops in Europe. The superpowers also agreed to reduce the number of nuclear weapons by 1/3 in START, so S-T-A-R-T, which stood for the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty in 1991. Further commitments were made to reduce this further in the future. Gorbachev's attempt to introduce a new constitution was rejected in the regions. Finally, in December 1991, Gorbachev dissolved the Soviet Union in his final act as president. There had been increased opposition throughout the year, including a failed military coup by a group of disgruntled army officers. Perestroika had the opposite effect to the effects that Gorbachev had hoped for. Living conditions worsened, and by 1990 to 1991, the majority of Soviet republics, also known as the Baltic states, were demanding independence. The USSR fragmented into many different states or countries in Europe and Asia, from the Baltic to Tajikistan. In January 1992, it became the Commonwealth of Independent States. The Iron Curtain had fallen, and the ideological conflict between the East and the West came to an end. So that is how the Cold War ended.